Welcome back. Last time we spent hours with the history, where Holmes came from, what he became, why he has never stopped. Tonight is something different, a new case, a new October, a specific street in Clerkenwell, and a woman who has been trying for 11 years to understand what happened to the finest thing her father ever made. Get comfortable. Drop a comment and tell me where you are. Let's go. October had returned to London in the specific quality that October always returned to London. Not gradually, not apologetically, but with the directness of a season that had no doubt about its own character and no interest in softening its arrival for the convenience of people who had been enjoying what had preceded it. The plane trees in the Baker Street neighborhood had their October color, the specific amber and yellow and the beginning of brown that communicated, as clearly as any calendar, that the year's particular kind of sustained warmth was done and that what remained of the year would be conducted in the register that the autumn and the winter required. The light had the quality of October light. Lower, more directed, present in the mornings with a clarity that the summer's diffuse warmth had not produced and that communicated both the beauty of the season and the cold that accompanied the beauty. Watson had arrived at Baker Street on the Tuesday of the second week of October 1898 through a morning that had this specific quality at its fullest and finest. The walk had taken him through the streets of the specific London that the October morning produced, the London that was neither the London of the summer's social season nor the London of the winter's fully indoor life, but the London of the transition, the city in the act of turning from one seasonal character to the other. The transition had a specific quality in the streets of the neighborhood between Watson's lodgings and Baker Street, which was the neighborhood of the residential professional middle class, the solicitors and the doctors and the various other categories of the professional person whose daily life was the indoor life of the office and the consulting room, and who consequently moved through the London streets with the specific quality of people for whom the streets were the passage between indoor spaces rather than the spaces of outdoor activity themselves. In October the passages had a particular quality, the quality of people who were returning, after the summer's various dispersals, to the specific form of the daily routine that the working year required and who were consequently present in the streets with the specific combination of the purposeful and the restored that the resumption of the routine produced in people for whom the routine was genuinely sustaining. Watson had walked through this specific quality of the October streets with the quality of someone who was simultaneously a part of the returning and an observer of it, who was himself returning to Baker Street after a summer in which the investigations had been quiet, and who was consequently experiencing both the return and the observation of the return in the specific double form that the investigations had made the natural mode of his engagement with the world. Watson had arrived at Baker Street on the Tuesday of the second week of October 1898 through a morning that had this specific quality at its fullest and finest. He had walked from his own lodgings, which was the walk that the October mornings most reliably produced in him, the walk of someone who was present in the specific atmosphere of the season with the quality of genuine attention, who was receiving the October London in the form it was rather than the form one would have preferred. He had been thinking, on the walk, about nothing in particular, which was the form of thinking that the best walking through the best autumn mornings produced. The ambient, unhurried, receptive attention that was not directed at anything specific and that consequently received everything. Baker Street had the quality of Baker Street in the October resumption. Holmes was in the sitting room with the specific quality that Holmes had when an investigation was genuinely concluded and the next had not yet arrived. The quality of a person who was maintaining their engagement with the world through the index and the various peripheral interests rather than through the directed, concentrated application of the full analytical capability that a genuine case produced. The fire was at its October level, fully present, the specific warmth of a fire that was not a concession to the cold but a genuinely necessary domestic element, the warmth of the fire that communicated that the outdoor season had become the indoor season again and that Baker Street was responding to the change with the appropriate adjustment to its domestic character. Watson settled into his armchair with the quality of someone arriving at the right place at the right time in the right season. The specific quality of Baker Street in the between investigations period had a character that Watson had come to value as something specific and irreplaceable in the sequence of the investigations, the character of the pause, the character of the space between one purposeful engagement and the next, which was neither the purposeful engagement itself nor the simple absence of it but a third thing, The active rest of the capable person who was genuinely at rest rather than merely inactive. Holmes in the between investigations mode was not the same Holmes as the between cases Holmes of the early years that Watson had first known. The early between cases Holmes had been someone whose inactivity was visibly painful, who had met the absence of occupation with the cocaine or the violin at 3 in the morning, or the various other manifestations of a person who was constitutionally unable to sustain the passive and who consequently found means of active engagement that fell short of the full engagement of a case but that were at least motion rather than stillness. The Holmes of the 10th investigations between cases periods was different, not serene, not comfortable with the passive in any simple sense, but more genuinely at rest than the early Holmes had been. As if the accumulated casework had provided, alongside the specific resolution of the cases themselves, a kind of resource that the between cases periods could draw on, a resource of completed things, of situations addressed and people helped and truth established, that gave the intervals a different quality than the intervals had had in the years before the accumulation had been possible. Watson had noticed this change across the 10 investigations and had not said anything about it, which was the right response, the response of someone who understood that the change was better acknowledged in the attending than in the stating, that to observe it aloud would be to make it into something that required Holmes to engage with rather than simply to embody. Holmes embodied it. Watson attended to the embodiment. This was the appropriate division of the labor between them in the dimension of the personal, and the 10 investigations had established it in exactly the form that both of them needed. Watson settled into his armchair with the quality of someone arriving at the right place at the right time in the right season. He had brought a medical journal he intended to read and had no particular expectation of reading it. The morning had the quality of the good Baker Street October morning. The fire, the light through the windows at the October angle, the particular quality of the between cases Baker Street that was both restful and charged in the specific way of a space that was temporarily at rest but that was constitutionally incapable of remaining so for long. The card arrived at 11. Mrs. Hudson brought it with the quality of Mrs. Hudson bringing cards in the October morning. Present, efficient, communicated in the form that communicated the information without editorializing about it. The card was on the tray with the specific presentation of something that had been placed there rather than merely deposited, and Watson set down his journal as Holmes took it up. Miss Edith Vane. An address in Saffron Hill, Clerkenwell. The address communicated, in the specific way that London addresses communicated, the character of the neighborhood and consequently something of the character of the person who occupied it, the Italian quarter of Clerkenwell, the neighborhood of precision craftsmen and their trades, the specific part of London where the making of fine things was the primary occupation of the streets and the buildings and the people who inhabited them. Holmes read the address with the quality of Holmes reading an address, the quality of a mind that was already constructing the preliminary picture from the available evidence before the person had arrived to complicate and correct the picture with the full substance of the actual situation. He said that the visitor was expected at 11:30 and that the morning's ambient quality would shortly be replaced by something with more direction in it. Watson set his journal aside entirely. The morning had produced what the best Baker Street mornings produced, the specific transition from the ambient to the purposeful, from the restful between cases quality to the directed forward motion of an investigation beginning. Miss Edith Vane arrived at 11:30 with the quality that the card had communicated in advance and that Watson, in the first assessment of the visitor that the 10 investigations had made him reliable at producing, confirmed and extended immediately. She was 41, with the physical presence of someone whose working life was conducted primarily with the hands and the eyes at close range, the slight forward inclination of someone who spent long hours working at a bench, the specific quality of the hands that the handling of precise instruments over many years produced. Not the hands of the amateur or the casual practitioner, but the hands of someone for whom the finest work was the daily work, whose accumulated capability was in the hands as much as anywhere else. She was not anxious. She was not urgent. She had the quality of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and who had arrived, in the act of coming to Baker Street, at the specific point where the carrying was going to end one way or another and who was consequently present in the specific mode of someone who had made a decision and who was now simply at the decision rather than approaching it. She sat down when Mrs. Hudson had gone, and she looked at Holmes and then at Watson with the assessing quality of a professional person entering a new professional situation, and she said, without preamble, that she had come about her father's tools. Watson had learned, across the 10 investigations, that the first words of the visitor's account were among the most reliably informative things the account produced. Not because the first words necessarily contained the most important information, often they did not, but because the choice of the first words communicated something about the person's relationship to their own situation that the subsequent account, more carefully managed and more deliberately shaped, sometimes obscured. The person who led with the chronological beginning communicated a relationship to the situation as a sequence of events. The person who led with the emotional charge communicated a relationship to the situation as a feeling. The person who led with the central fact communicated a relationship to the situation as a problem to be addressed. Miss Vane had led with the central fact, the tools. Not her father, not his death, not the 11 years, not the discovery 3 months ago. The tools. The specific thing that the situation was about in the most fundamental sense, the thing that the question had always been about, whose presence or absence and whose history and whose current location were what mattered. The choice communicated to Watson, before another word had been spoken, the character of the person who had made it. A person whose relationship to her own situation was the relationship of the professional intelligence to a professional problem, whose emotional investment in the situation was real and deep, but whose instinct was to address the situation through the application of the intelligence rather than the expression of the investment. She sat down when Mrs. Hudson had gone, and she looked at Holmes and then at Watson with the assessing quality of a professional person entering a new professional situation, and she said, without preamble, that she had come about her father's tools. Holmes received this opening with the full quality of his attention. Watson attended to Miss Vane with the quality that 10 investigations had developed in him as the most specifically valuable of the various capabilities the investigations required. The quality of genuine, patient, unhurried attention to the person and the situation, attending to both the content of the account and the character of the person communicating it, receiving what was being offered in the fullest available form rather than in the reduced form that impatience or the assumption of advanced knowledge produced. The account was clear and carefully organized, in the way of accounts communicated by people who had been living with the material for long enough that they understood its structure and had developed the ability to communicate it in the form that the structure required rather than in the form that the emotional investment in it produced. Edith Vane was not telling the story of her father's death and her own grief and the 11 years of a question carried without resolution, though all of these were present beneath the surface of the account. She was telling the specific case, the tools, the commission, the disappearance, the 11 years, and the 3-month-old discovery that had brought her to Baker Street. Her father had been Felix Vane, a maker of precision engraving tools who had worked in Saffron Hill for the last 20 years of his life. He had been, within the specific community of the Clerkenwell craft trades, a man of particular distinction. The tools he made had a quality that the best engravers in London and in much of Europe had recognized and sought. Not the quantity. Felix Vane had worked slowly and carefully and had produced a limited number of tools in any given year, but the quality, the specific combination of the steel and the edge and the balance that made the difference, in the hand of someone who understood what a fine tool was, between the work that was adequate and the work that was exactly right. In the last 2 years of his professional life, Felix had undertaken a specific commission. A complete set of fine engraving tools for an Italian-born engraver named Augusto Carrera, who had been working in London for 20 years and who had the specific reputation, within the engraving trade, of being the finest practitioner of scientific and cartographic illustration then working in the city. The commission had been the most significant of Felix Vane's career. Not the largest, not the most commercially valuable, but the most meaningful in the specific sense that Edith communicated with the care of someone who had understood this from the way her father spoke about it, the sense of the maker who had found, in a commission, the occasion for the fullest expression of what his capability had become across the decades of its development. Carrera had died in the spring of 1887, before the tools were completed. The commission had been finished that spring. Felix had worked through Carrera's death, completing the work with the specific quality of dedication that the work deserved regardless of whether the person who had commissioned it would ever receive it. He had died himself in the autumn of the same year. Edith, 29 years old and newly bereaved and in the process of establishing herself in the workshop that was now her own, had noted the absence of the completed commission tools from the workshop inventory and had assumed, in the reasonable but uninvestigated way of someone managing too many urgent things simultaneously, that they had been collected by Carrere's estate. 11 years. Periodic recurrences of the question, each one unresolved in the absence of any specific occasion to resolve it. And then, 3 months ago, a conversation at a trade gathering in the city, with an older engraver whose knowledge of the instrument trade was deep and long and whose mention of a set of tools in the possession of a man named Devers, a specific set of tools, described with the specific details of their character that Edith had held in her professional memory for 11 years, had produced in her the immediate, certain knowledge of what she had heard. She paused at this point in the account and she said, with the directness of a professional person who was clear about what she was asking and who wanted to communicate the clarity precisely, that she was not asking for anyone to be prosecuted. The question of who had the tools and by what chain of possession they had come to have them was not the question she needed answered in any formal or legal sense. She needed the honest account. The complete, truthful understanding of what had happened to the finest thing her father had ever made, in the form that would allow her to be in relationship with that fact rather than in the 11-year relationship with the absence of it. Watson had heard this form of request before, in variations that were becoming, across the 10 investigations, the most specifically human and the most specifically moving of the various forms that the investigations received. The request not for the formal mechanism, not for the prosecution or the vindication or the institutional correction, but for the honest understanding in the complete form that the understanding required. The request that was the most difficult to address through the ordinary channels because the ordinary channels dealt in the formally actionable rather than the humanly necessary. Holmes said that the investigation would proceed on the understanding that the complete account was the objective, and that the complete account required 3 distinct threads to be followed simultaneously and then assembled into the single coherent picture that the 3 together produced. He said this with the quality of someone who had already, in the course of the account, identified the structure of the inquiry and who was communicating the structure as a way of communicating to the person requesting the inquiry that the specific thing they had asked for was both understood and attainable. Watson attended to all of this and then he said, when Holmes had finished the structural outline, that he would like to know more about Carrere, about the engraver's work and what had distinguished it and why Felix Vane had understood the commission as the one most worthy of his best capability. He said this not as a component of the analytical inquiry but because it was the most specifically human of the available questions, the question that would produce the understanding of what the tools had meant rather than merely what had happened to them, and the understanding of what the tools had meant was, Watson had come to understand, the most important thing an investigation could produce before the investigation began. Edith told him. She told it with the care of someone who had attended, over the 11 years of the carrying, to the meaning of the relationship between her father and the work and the engraver who had commissioned it. Watson attended to her telling with the quality of attention that the investigations had taught him to bring to the accounts of the people at the human center of the situations, the quality not of someone who was waiting for information but of someone who was genuinely present with what was being communicated, receiving the communication in the form it deserved rather than the form that would have been most efficient. What she communicated, in the telling, was something that went beyond the biographical facts of her father's life and career. It was the specific quality of what the engraving trade was, in the Clerkenwell of the 1880s, for the people who did it well and who understood what the doing well required. The trade was not a commercial activity in the simple sense of the exchange of services for money, though it was that, and the economic dimension of the craftsmen's lives was real and not to be dismissed. It was something more than the commercial. The specific form of the life in which the capability and the work and the daily making were the primary substance, in which the measurement of a day was not the measurement of the income produced but the measurement of the quality of what the hands had done. Felix Vane had understood this about his trade from the beginning of it, Edith said, had understood, from the earliest years of his apprenticeship and throughout the 20 years of his own practice, that the making of the finest tools was not a technical achievement separable from the life of the person making them but the expression of the life at its most fully itself. The finest tools required the specific combination of the technical knowledge and the cultivated patience and the genuine care about the outcome that decades of serious practice produced in someone who had both the capability and the commitment. Felix had both. The capability had been present from early in his career, recognized by the community around him as something unusual. The commitment had been what the capability had required and what Felix had provided throughout the long career without wavering and without the reduction of the commitment that the passage of time sometimes produced in even the most capable practitioners. Edith told him. She told it with the care of someone who had attended, over the 11 years of the carrying, to the meaning of the relationship between her father and the work, and the engraver who had commissioned it, had attended to it with the specific quality of the instrument maker's child, who understood what fine tools were and what the making of them at the highest level required and what it meant when a maker of Felix Vane's specific quality had found, in a specific commission, the occasion for the fullest expression of the capability that a lifetime's development had produced. Carrere's work had been, in the specific community of the engraving trade, the standard against which other scientific and cartographic illustration was measured. Not the most prolific, not the most commercially active, but the finest, the person whose understanding of what the finest engraving tool could achieve in the finest hand was most complete and most consistently demonstrated. Felix had known this. Felix had known Carrere, as the Clerkenwell craftsmen knew each other in the specific form of the professional community of people whose trades intersected and whose work was in daily dialogue with each other's. The commission had been, for Felix, both the commercial and the personal occasion, the occasion when the person who most fully understood what his tools were and what they could do had asked him to make, for that person's specific use, the finest tools he was capable of making. And then Carrere had died. And Felix had finished the tools anyway, in the autumn of 1887, with the knowledge that the person the tools had been made for would never hold them. Watson attended to this part of the account with the full quality of the attention it deserved and found in it the specific thing that the 10 investigations had consistently found at the center of the most human of their situations. The maker's relationship to the finest thing they had made, and the specific difficulty of that relationship when the making had been completed and the intended recipient was gone. The Clerkenwell visit was Watson's portion of the investigation, and he undertook it on the second morning with the quality that the best of the investigative visits had when the territory was genuinely interesting and when the person accompanying him was the right person for the territory. Edith Vane met him at the Baker Street cab rank at 9 in the morning, and they took the cab to Saffron Hill together, through the October London of the morning commute, the streets with the specific quality of the working city beginning its daily engagement, the traders and the workers and the various categories of purposeful motion that the October morning produced in the parts of London where people went to work rather than to be seen. The route took them through the northern edges of the city and into the specific neighborhood that Clerkenwell's Saffron Hill occupied, the Italian quarter, the craftsman's quarter, the neighborhood of small workshops and specialist trades, and the particular combination of the domestic and the professional that the craftsman's district of a Victorian city produced. Watson attended to it with the quality of someone who was receiving a neighborhood for the first time with the full attention it deserved. Saffron Hill was not a neighborhood Watson had had occasion to attend to closely in any of the previous investigations, and the neighborhood had the specific quality of a place that rewarded the attentive first visit. The quality of the particular and the specific of a place that was entirely itself in a way that communicated, through the character of its streets and its buildings and the nature of the activity in them, the specific form of working life that had shaped it. The workshops were visible from the street in the specific way of the craftsman's district. Not hidden, not presented, simply there in the form of the working places they were, the windows of the workshop ground floors open or glassed in ways that communicated the work inside, the specific sounds and smells of precision manufacture drifting out into the street and mingling with the sounds and smells of the Italian coffee houses and the various other elements of the neighborhood's daily life. It was, Watson thought, a neighborhood that communicated the value of the made thing in the most direct available form, by being a place where made things were being made, continuously and seriously, by people who had dedicated their working lives to the specific capability that the making required. Edith's workshop was on the ground floor of a narrow building 2 streets from the main thoroughfare of Saffron Hill proper. Watson attended to it with the specific quality of assessment that the investigations had developed in him for the spaces that the investigations moved through, not the casual glance of the visitor but the sustained, directed attention of someone who understood that the space communicated the person and the life as directly as any verbal account could. The workshop communicated exactly what Edith had communicated in the Baker Street interview. The quality of someone whose working life was the expression of a genuine vocation, whose engagement with the specific capability that the vocation required was the engagement of someone who had chosen it with full understanding of what the choosing meant and who had maintained the choice across the years with the steady, undemonstrative commitment of someone for whom the daily work was genuinely sustaining rather than merely productive. The bench was the central element. Long, solid, lit from the window above it with the October light that made the fine work visible in the specific form that fine work required to be seen. The tools on the bench and on the walls had the quality of tools that were used regularly and cared for consistently, present in their positions with the specific character of things whose positions had been determined by the logic of the work and maintained by the habit of the person doing the work. Everything in the workshop communicated the quality of the genuine practitioner, and Watson attended to the communication with the specific pleasure that the evidence of genuine craft produced in him. He asked to see the space where Felix had worked, which was, Edith communicated with a brief, specific gesture, the same space. The workshop had been Felix's workshop, and Edith had continued in the same space, maintaining and in certain respects expanding the practice that her father had established, in the specific form of continuity that the craftsman's inheritance of a parent's trade produced when the inheritance was genuine rather than merely nominal. Watson stood in the specific space for a moment and attended to it with the quality he brought to all the significant spaces of the investigations. The quality of someone who was receiving what the space communicated without requiring it to communicate anything in particular, who was open to whatever the space was rather than directing the attention toward what he had come prepared to find. The space communicated the long continuity of the work, the specific quality of a place that had been doing the same essential thing for 30 years in succession, Felix's 20 years and then Edith's 11, and that had consequently the specific character of the well-worn, the thoroughly inhabited, the place that knew what it was because it had been itself for a very long time. He asked about the specific location where the commissioned tools had been kept while Felix was finishing them. Edith showed him a section of the far wall, away from the main bench, where the higher value work in progress had been stored. The storage had the quality of the careful, the specific care of someone who understood that the best work in progress required the specific conditions that its quality deserved, the protection from the ordinary risks of the workshop, the maintained awareness of what was stored there and what it represented. It was empty. Had been empty, the specific location where the commission had been kept, since the investigation of the inventory in the months following Felix's death. 11 years of the specific emptiness of a space that had held something significant and that had been empty since. Watson attended to the emptiness with the quality that the 10 investigations had taught him to bring to significant absences. The quality not of frustration but of understanding, the understanding that the absence was itself information and that the information the absence provided was directing rather than closing. The network of Clerkenwell craftsmen was the specific territory that the investigation needed to enter next, and Edith was the specific guide for that territory, the person who knew the community, who had the standing in it that came from 11 years of being a part of it, who was known to the older members of the trade as Felix Vane's daughter and consequently as someone whose family history within the trade had the depth and the accumulated trust that only the long presence produced. They spent the better part of the second day moving through the neighborhood together, Watson attending to each conversation with the full quality of the attention he brought to the human dimension of the investigations, Edith providing both the introduction and the context. The specific quality of moving through a neighborhood with someone who knew it and was known by it was a quality that the investigations had given Watson several occasions to experience, the quality of the territory that opened differently for the insider than for the outsider, of conversations that were possible because of who was doing the asking rather than what was being asked. The conversations had a specific rhythm. Edith would make the introduction, providing in a sentence or two the context that established both the professional relationship and the current purpose, that she was Felix Vane's daughter, that she was inquiring about the movement of a specific commission through the trade, that she was asking for the help of people whose knowledge of the trade was the knowledge she was trying to access. The introduction was received in the specific way that introductions in professional communities were received when the community trusted the person making them and trusted the purpose for which they were being made, with the specific openness of someone who was prepared to give what they had because the giving was the right response. Watson received the conversations with the full quality of the attention they deserved, attending to both the content and the manner of the communication, to both what was being said and what the saying communicated about the person who was saying it. The craftsmen of Saffron Hill were people whose lives had been lived in a specific form of sustained, close attention to the details of their work, and the sustained close attention to the details of their work had produced in them the specific capability of accurate observation and precise communication that Watson found consistently valuable in the accounts that the investigations required. They did not exaggerate. They did not confabulate. They communicated what they knew in the form they knew it, with the specific honesty of people for whom the inaccurate account was a form of failure analogous to the inaccurate work, something that the commitment to the genuine quality of the thing would not permit. They spent the better part of the second day moving through the neighborhood together, Watson attending to each conversation with the full quality of the attention he brought to the human dimension of the investigations, Edith providing both the introduction and the context that allowed each conversation to produce what it was capable of producing rather than the reduced version that the visit of an outsider would have produced. The engravers and the instrument makers and the various other precision craftsmen of Saffron Hill and its surrounds had the specific quality of people who worked with fine things and who consequently had, through the long practice of attending closely to the details that fine work required, the specific capability of close and accurate observation that the investigation needed their accounts to reflect. They did not generalize. They communicated in specifics, in the vocabulary of the trade, in the precise and particular form of people whose professional lives required the precise and particular and who had consequently developed the habit of it in their general communication as well as in their work. The account of Devers came from 3 separate sources in the course of the day, each account adding a dimension that the others had not provided, the 3 together producing the specific picture of a man whose current possession of the commission tools was unambiguous and whose understanding of what he possessed was, at least in the account of the trade community, the understanding of someone who knew he had fine tools without knowing their full history. Devers's workshop was 2 streets from Edith's. Watson and Edith visited it in the late afternoon of the second day, with the October light beginning to go and the workshop lit with the supplementary lamp that the precision work required when the natural light was insufficient. Devers was there, a man of 53, Watson assessed, with the physical character of someone whose 40 years in the engraving trade had left its mark in the specific form that 40 years of fine work left on the people who did it, the quality of extreme care, of the cultivated slowness that the precision required, of the person who moved through the world with the specific economy of motion that the habit of the fine work produced. He received them with the mild surprise of someone being visited unexpectedly and the genuine politeness of a craftsman in his own workshop, the specific combination of the slightly defensive and the fundamentally open that professional people in their working spaces tended to produce when the visit was unexpected but not threatening. Watson attended to him with the full quality that the visit deserved. He was, Watson found in the attending, a good craftsman. Not the level of Felix Vane, the conversation about the tools, which Watson initiated carefully and which Devers engaged with the specific willingness of a craftsman talking about what he knew, communicated that Devers understood the quality of the tools he worked with in the form of someone who used fine tools well rather than the form of someone who had made fine tools and consequently understood their making from the inside. But good in the specific and real sense of a practitioner who cared about the work and who had the skills and the habits that the caring required. The tools were on the bench. Watson attended to them with the specific quality of attention he brought to the significant objects of the investigations, the objects that carried history in their physical character in the way that the finest made things always carried history, whose specific quality communicated the specific quality of the person who had made them as directly as any verbal account. He had not expected, before seeing them, to be able to read them in the way that Edith's account and the investigation had taught him to read them. He was not an engraver. He was not a precision instrument maker. He was a doctor whose professional life had required the handling of instruments of various kinds and whose hands had consequently the specific knowledge of what a precisely made instrument felt like when you held it, the knowledge of the balance and the weight and the specific quality of the edge or the point or the surface that communicated, in the language of the hand, whether the thing had been made with care or without it. He did not hold the tools. It was not his place to hold them, in this workshop in the presence of Devers, without an invitation that had not been offered and that he had not asked for. But he could see them from where he sat, in the October afternoon light of the workshop, and what he could see communicated what the investigation had established. The quality of the fine making, the specific character of the tools that were unlike other tools of the same category in the way that the finest things of any category were unlike the merely good things of the same category. The handles had a quality of the finished and the considered, a quality not of the decorative but of the precisely right, the handles that had been made in the specific form that the specific weight and balance of the tool required, in the form that a maker who understood what the hand needed from the handle would give to it. The blades or the tips or whatever the specific element of each specific tool was that made it the kind of tool it was had the quality of the fine edge. Present, precise, maintained with the care that the finest edge required and that, once present, could only be maintained and never recreated in exactly the same form. Watson found, in attending to the tools at this distance, something that he had not expected to find, the specific form of the understanding that the physical evidence of the finest making produced in the person who attended to it carefully enough. The tools were, in the most specific and legible sense, a portrait of the person who had made them, a portrait not in the metaphorical sense but in the direct sense in W. H. The finest made thing was always the most direct available expression of the person's most fully developed capability. Felix Vane was in the tools in the specific form that Paget had been in the Holmes illustrations and Edmund Gale had been in the formula and Gilbert Mast had been in the watch. The finest made things were the person, not the person's product. They were the person in the most fully and specifically expressed form available. The tools were on the bench. Watson attended to them with the specific quality of attention he brought to the significant objects of the investigations, the objects that were both physically present and historically loaded, both the thing itself and the history of the thing, both the tool and what the tool communicated about the person who had made it and the person who now had it. They were, he could see this from the quality of the metal and the specific character of the edge and the handle finish, which were the qualities that Edith had described to him in the Baker Street interview and that he had consequently known to look for, exactly what the investigation said they were. The finest work of a man who had done nothing but fine work, produced at the peak of the capabilities development, present now in this workshop 11 years after the making. He asked Devers, with the care of someone who was asking a question whose answer mattered, where the tools had come from. Devers said that he had acquired them 9 years ago from a dealer in used instruments and precision tools, a man named Aldous who had operated from a premises in the city and who had since closed the business. He had paid a fair price, he said, for what the dealer had presented as an exceptional set whose provenance he had not been able to establish beyond a general account of having acquired them from a workshop sale in the area. He had not investigated further. The tools had been, in the 9 years of his possession and use of them, the best tools he had ever worked with, and he had maintained them with the specific care that the quality deserved. Watson attended to this account with the full attention it deserved and found in it exactly what the investigation had expected to find, the honest account of a good faith acquisition whose specific chain of provenance was the chain that the investigation needed to trace back through the dealer and the workshop sale to the origin that the story required. Devers had no knowledge of what the tools were beyond the knowledge his hands and his eyes provided. He had no knowledge of Felix Vane. He had no knowledge of Carrera's commission. He was, in the specific form of the innocent possessor, entirely and genuinely innocent. Watson told him nothing on that visit. The visit was for observation and for the establishment of the picture of Devers that the investigation needed before the resolution could be shaped. He thanked Devers for his time with the warmth of someone who meant the thanks, and he and Edith walked back through the October evening toward the main thoroughfare and the cab that would take them back to Baker Street. Holmes had spent the 2 days of the Clerkenwell investigation in the specific channels that the analytical dimension of the inquiry required. Watson had returned to Baker Street on the evenings of both days and had communicated the day's findings in the specific form of the synthesis evening that the investigations had developed as their most productive working format, the evening in which the separate threads of the inquiry were laid alongside each other and the picture they collectively produced was assembled in the form that would direct the following day's work. On the first evening, the picture was the preliminary one. Devers in his Clerkenwell workshop, the tools on his bench, the good faith acquisition from the dealer whose own records were no longer available, the chain of possession incomplete in the specific way that a chain of possession was incomplete when each link had been honest and none of the links had been illegal and there was consequently no formal mechanism that had required the recording of the history. The picture communicated the investigation's most pressing next step. The establishment of what had happened between the commission's completion in Felix's workshop and its arrival in the possession of the dealer, which was the gap that the probate records would need to fill. On the second evening, Holmes communicated the first results of the probate research. Carrere's estate had been properly administered and its contents properly inventoried. The inventory did not include the tools, for the reason that the tools had never been in Carrere's possession, had been placed with Felix at the time of Carrere's death. Felix's estate had also been properly inventoried, and the tools were equally absent from Felix's estate inventory, for the reason that they had already left the workshop before the inventory was taken. The gap between the two inventories, the gap in which the tools had left Felix's workshop, was the specific window that Mocchetti's account would need to fill. The Mocchetti visit had been planned for the third morning, and Holmes's preliminary research through the trade contacts that his network of informants in the various specialist communities of London provided had identified Mocchetti as the person most likely to have the specific knowledge of Felix Vane's professional relationships that the investigation required. The research had been conducted with the characteristic efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and who had, through the decades of the work, developed the specific network of contacts that allowed the efficient access to the specialist knowledge that the various categories of investigation required. Watson had found, across the 10 investigations, that the evenings of the synthesis were among the most specifically valuable of the investigation's various forms of work, not the most dramatic, not the most immediately satisfying, but the most structurally important in the specific sense of being the work that transformed the separate threads into the coherent picture. The synthesis required both of them. Holmes's analytical intelligence to identify what the collected threads implied and Watson's human intelligence to identify what the threads communicated about the people in the situation and what the people's situations required. The best syntheses were the ones in which both were fully present, in which the analytical and the human were genuinely in dialogue rather than the one directing and the other receiving. Holmes had spent the 2 days of the Clerkenwell investigation in the specific channels that the analytical dimension of the inquiry required, the probate records, the records of the auction houses that had handled estate sales in the Clerkenwell area in the relevant period, the register of deaths for the parish records that would establish the specific timeline of the 2 deaths and the gap between them that the investigation needed to account for. The probate records for Carrere's estate had been managed by a solicitor in the city whose records, still maintained in the firm's archive, provided the specific account of what had happened to Carrere's London assets in the months following his death. The estate had been administered by Carrere's brother, who had come from Italy for the purpose and who had returned to Italy when the administration was complete. The London assets, the workshop contents, the completed works, the professional materials, had been disposed of through the specific mechanism of the estate sale conducted by an agent appointed by the solicitor. The estate inventory was preserved in the archive. The tools did not appear in it. The commission had been placed with Felix Vane and had not been collected before Carrere's death, and consequently the tools had not been in Carrere's workshop when the estate inventory was taken. They had been in Felix's workshop, in the specific storage location that Edith had shown Watson on the second day's Clerkenwell visit, until the weeks before Felix's own death. Holmes established, through the register of deaths and the specific timeline of the weeks preceding Felix's death in the autumn of 1887, the specific period in which the tools had left Felix's workshop. The departure had occurred in a narrow window of time. After the commission had been completed and after Carrere's death had made collection impossible, and before Felix's own death had transferred the workshop and its contents to Edith's care. The probate records for Felix Vane's estate, simpler, briefer, the estate of a craftsman of modest means whose primary legacy was the workshop and its contents, did not include the commission tools either. They had not been in the workshop when the estate inventory was taken. They had been somewhere else. The somewhere else was the specific thing that the synthesis required, and Holmes found it through the third thread of the investigation, the thread that Watson had identified from the beginning as the one most likely to produce the human understanding beneath the factual one. The old man's name was Mr. Stefano Marchetti, and he was 81 years old, and he had been a maker of fine printing type in Saffron Hill for 53 years before his retirement a decade ago. He had known Felix Vane as a neighbor and a colleague in the specific form that craftsmen of adjacent trades in the same neighborhood knew each other, not the close friendship of the daily social intercourse, but the professional respect and the accumulated human familiarity of people who had worked in the same small community for decades and who consequently understood each other's work and each other's character with the specific depth that the long professional adjacency produced. Holmes had found him through the inquiry at the trade gathering and had visited him on the second morning at his retirement lodgings in a street off Hatton Garden. Watson joined him for this visit, because the synthesis required Watson's presence rather than Holmes's alone. The human understanding that Marchetti's account would produce was the human understanding that Watson was most capable of receiving and communicating. Marchetti was, at 81, a man of the specific quality that very old craftsmen sometimes had, the quality of someone whose capabilities had been the primary substance of their long life and who consequently, in the retirement from those capabilities, had the specific alert, alive, engaged quality of a person who was still entirely present in the world even though the specific form of the engagement with it that had defined the life was no longer available. He had a memory of the specific kind that Watson associated with people who had spent their working lives attending closely to details, a memory not of the general and the ambient but of the specific and the particular, the memory of someone for whom the details had always been the thing. His lodgings were the lodgings of a retired craftsman of modest means and considerable dignity, kept with the specific care of someone who had always kept things with care, maintained in the specific form of someone for whom the maintenance of the environment was the natural extension of the maintenance of the work, the natural form of the life continued in the register of the retirement. The room communicated the long life. The specific accumulation of things that a long life in a specific trade and a specific neighborhood produced, each thing having its specific history and its specific meaning and its specific place in the organization of the environment that the person who had assembled it understood and that the visitor could only begin to read. Watson attended to the room with the quality he brought to all the significant spaces of the investigations, finding in the attending the preliminary understanding of the person who had made the space what it was that always informed and completed the understanding that the conversation then produced. The room said that Marchetti was a man who had attended carefully to the things around him across a long life, who had maintained the things that were worth maintaining and who had set aside the things that were not, and who had consequently arrived at 81 with an environment that was genuinely the expression of the long life rather than the accumulated residue of a life that had been insufficiently attended to. The room was Marchetti. The Marchetti Watson found in the conversation was the person the room had communicated. Marchetti was, at 81, a man of the specific quality that very old craftsmen sometimes had. The quality of someone whose capabilities had been the primary substance of their long life and who consequently, in the retirement from those capabilities, had the specific alert, alive, engaged quality of a person who was still entirely present in the world even though the specific form of the engagement with it that had defined the life was no longer available. He had a memory of the specific kind that Watson associated with people who had spent their working lives attending closely to details, a memory not of the general and the ambient but of the specific and the particular, the memory of someone for whom the details had always been the thing. He remembered the conversation with Felix with the precise quality of someone who had understood, at the time, that the conversation was significant, that what Felix was telling him was not the ordinary professional communication but something more weighted, something that communicated the specific quality of the person at the point of the decision that would define what happened to the finest thing they had ever made. Felix had come to him, Marchetti said, in the October of 1887, the specific month that Holmes, from the register, had established as the window in which the tools had left the workshop. He had come in the evening, after the working day, in the way that craftsmen came to each other's homes when the thing they had to discuss was not the professional communication of the working hours but the more personal communication of what the professional life had produced at its most specifically human. He had brought the tools with him. Watson attended to this specific detail with the full quality of attention it deserved, the image of Felix Vane carrying the commission, the finest work of his professional life, through the October evening of Saffron Hill to the home of the colleague he trusted most with the question he had been carrying since Carrera's death. The carrying of the tools through the October evening communicated, in the specific form of the physical act, everything that the investigation had been establishing through the documents and the accounts and the formal record, the specific quality of Felix's relationship to the commission, the specific character of what the commission had meant and what its completion in the absence of its intended recipient had produced in the person who had completed it. You did not carry the finest thing you had ever made through an October evening to a colleague's home in order to discuss what should be done with it unless the thing mattered to you in the most fundamental sense, unless it was not merely a commercial product whose disposal was a practical question but an expression of your best capability and your deepest professional commitment, whose disposition required the specific kind of deliberate attention that the finest things always required. Watson found, in attending to this detail as Marchetti communicated it, the specific quality that the 10 investigations had consistently produced at the point when the human center of the situation became fully visible, the quality of recognition, of understanding something that he had known was important without knowing what it was, of the abstract becoming specific and the specific becoming the human reality that the investigation had been trying to recover. Felix Vane carrying the commission through the October evening of Saffron Hill was Felix Vane at the most specifically himself, the person most fully expressed in the act of doing what the finest thing he had made required of him, regardless of the difficulty and the grief of the specific circumstances in which that requirement had presented itself. He had brought the tools with him. Watson attended to this specific detail with the full quality of attention it deserved, the image of Felix Vane carrying the commission, the finest work of his professional life, through the October evening of Saffron Hill to the home of the colleague he trusted most with the question he had been carrying since Carrera's death. The question had been this: the tools had been made for Carrera. Carrera was dead. No one else had commissioned them. And the question beneath the question that Felix had not stated in those precise terms but that Marchetti had heard in the quality of what Felix was communicating, was the question of what a maker owed to the finest thing they had made, in the specific circumstances of its having been completed without any recipient available to receive it. Marchetti had understood the question in those terms because he had been a maker himself for 50 years and he understood what it meant for a maker of Felix Vane's specific quality to have completed the finest work of the career and to have no one to give it to. He understood it not in the abstract form of someone who had been told about such situations but in the specific, grounded form of someone who had come close to such a situation himself, who had, in the course of the long career, made things that he had understood to be the finest expressions of what his capability was capable of, and who had consequently understood, in the making of them, that the making created an obligation that the simple delivery to a paying customer did not exhaust. Watson attended to this dimension of Marchetti's account with the quality of someone who was receiving something that completed an understanding he had been building across all 10 investigations without having arrived at its most complete form until this specific moment. The obligation the making created. Not the commercial obligation, the contract, the commission, the agreed price, but the human and professional obligation that the making at the highest level produced in the person who did it. the obligation to ensure that the finest thing found the form of its existence in the world that the finest thing deserved. This was what Felix Vane had understood and had acted on in the October evening of 1887. This was what Marchetti had recognized and had helped Felix to address by providing the specific knowledge that the addressing required. This was what the investigation had recovered from the 11 years of the absence. Not merely the factual account of where the tools had gone, but the understanding of why they had gone in the form they had gone, and what the going communicated about Felix Vane and about the quality of his understanding of what the finest making required of the person who did it. Watson wrote this in the journal too, alongside the account of the carrying through the October evening and the conversation with Marchetti and the conclusion with Devers. He wrote it in the form it deserved. The form of something that mattered, that was worth the careful record and the careful formulation and the honest account of what it meant. The journal entry for the instrument maker of Saffron Hill was one of the longest he had written, not because the investigation had been complicated in the analytical sense but because the understanding it had reduced was the kind of understanding that required the full space of the honest account to be communicated in the form it was. Marchetti had understood the question in those terms because he had been a maker himself for 50 years and he understood what it meant for a maker of Felix Vane's specific quality to have completed the finest work of the career and to have no one to give it to. It was not a simple logistical problem. It was a specific form of the maker's most essential and most difficult obligation, the obligation that came not from the commercial arrangement, not from the contract or the commission or the agreed price, but from the making itself, from the specific character of what the making was when it was done at the highest level. The finest made thing was not merely a product. It was an argument. An argument made by the maker's full capability and full commitment for the proposition that the finest thing was worth making and worth maintaining and worth using in the form that the finest thing deserved. The finest tools deserved the finest hands. The finest work of Felix Vane's professional life deserved to be in the hands that would use it as it deserved, and the obligation to put it there did not expire with the death of the original intended recipient. Marchetti told this part of the account slowly and with the quality of someone who was communicating not merely his memory of a conversation but his own understanding of what the conversation had been about, his own understanding, developed across the 50 years of the making life and the 10 years of the retirement in which the making life was present in memory rather than in practice, of what Felix had been asking and why he had been asking it and what the right answer was. He said that he had understood, when Felix arrived with the tools, that the decision had already been made in its essential character, that Felix was not asking for permission or for validation, but for the specific knowledge that would allow the decision to be executed correctly. Felix knew what he wanted to do, give the tools to the person who would use them as they deserved. What he needed was the knowledge of who that person was. And Marchetti had the knowledge, accumulated across 5 decades of the neighborhood's professional life, of who that person was. The question had been this: the tools had been made for Carrère. Carrère was dead. No one else had commissioned them. No one else, in Felix's assessment, had the specific understanding of what the tools were and what they were capable of that would allow them to be used in the form their quality deserved. He did not want to sell them, would not sell them, because selling them to someone who did not understand what they were would have been a specific form of wrong that he was not willing to commit. He did not want to keep them. He wanted to give them to the person who would use them as they deserved to be used. He had asked Marchetti who that person was. Not who was the finest engraver in London. Felix knew the answer to that question, and the answer had been Carrère, and Carrère was dead. The second finest. The person who, in Marchetti's knowledge of the trade's entire working community, was most qualified to receive the tools and most likely to understand what they were receiving and what the receiving required of them. Marchetti had thought carefully. He had the specific knowledge of the trade's working community that the Long Clerkenwell presence and the adjacent craft had produced in him, knowledge not of the published reputation but of the actual daily quality of the work, the knowledge of someone who had been watching the engravers and the instrument makers and the various other precision craftsmen of the neighborhood at their work for 5 decades. He had given Felix a name. Watson asked the name with the specific quality of someone who already knew, from the shape of the investigation, that the name would not be Devers. It was not Devers. It was the name of a man who had been, in the autumn of 1887, a working engraver of considerable distinction whose specific area of work, the production of fine cartographic and scientific plates, had been the area in which Carrera had been supreme and in which this second man had been, in the community's knowledge, the next. The man had retired from engraving 15 years ago, when an injury to his principal hand had made the fine work impossible, and had died 7 years ago. Felix had given the tools to this man, had brought them to him directly, in the week before his own death, with a specific account of what they were and where they had come from and why the giving was the right disposition of the finest thing he had made. The man had received them with the understanding and the gratitude that Felix's giving had deserved. And then the man had retired, and his workshop had been sold, and the tools had passed through the dealer and then into the possession of Devers. The chain was complete. Every link was established. The picture was assembled. Holmes communicated it to Watson and to Edith on the evening of the third day, in the Baker Street sitting room with the October fire at its full level and the evening light gone and the gas lamps providing the specific quality of the lit interior in the dark outdoor world that Baker Street's best autumn evenings produced. He communicated it with the care of someone who understood that the communication was not merely the delivery of information but the delivery of the understanding that the information required. This was a dimension of Holmes's capability that Watson had come to appreciate across the 10 investigations as something more than the simple efficiency of the brilliant analyst conveying findings to their client. It was the specific quality of Holmes's understanding of what the investigation's purpose was, the understanding that the facts were never the end point but the foundation, and that the foundation was only valuable in the form of the understanding it was capable of supporting. The sitting room in the third evening had the quality of all the Baker Street synthesis evenings at their most complete. The fire at its full October level, the 3 people in the room each present with the full quality of the attention that the specific moment required, the specific combination of the analytical and the human that the Baker Street investigations had always required at their most significant points. Holmes at his chair. Watson in his. Edith in the visitor's chair with the quality she had had throughout the investigation. The patient, waiting quality of someone who had been carrying a question for 11 years and who was at the point of the answer. Holmes began with the factual architecture. The probate records. The estate inventories. The timeline established from the register of deaths. The specific window of the tool's departure from Felix's workshop. He communicated these with the precision that the facts required, and Watson attended to Edith's reception of each element with the quality of someone assessing not the facts themselves but what the facts were doing to the picture that Edith had been carrying for 11 years, the picture of the absence, the picture of the 11-year question, the picture that the account was now replacing with something more complete and more specifically honest. He communicated it with the care of someone who understood that the communication was not merely the delivery of information but the delivery of the understanding that the information required, the understanding that was not the simple summary of what had happened but the full picture of what had happened in the form that honored both the investigation that had produced it and the person who had asked for it. Edith received the account with the quality that Watson had been attending to her with throughout the investigation, the quality of the person who had been carrying a question for 11 years and who was receiving, in the course of the account, the answer in the complete form that the question had deserved. Not a simple answer. Not an answer that resolved everything cleanly. An answer that was as complicated and as human as the situation had always been, and that was consequently the most honest available form of the answer. Her father had finished the finest tools he had ever made in the knowledge that the person they had been made for was dead, and he had resolved the specific difficulty of that completion, the specific difficulty of the maker who has produced the finest thing and cannot give it to the intended recipient, by doing the most deliberate and the most genuinely considered thing available. By giving them to the person best qualified to receive them, in the full knowledge that the giving was right even though the original intention had been made impossible by Carrera's death. The giving had worked, in the specific and imperfect way that deliberate acts worked when the world intervened between the intention and the outcome. The immediate recipient had understood what he had received and had used it in the form it deserved for the years available to him. The subsequent chain of possession had not been designed and had not been ideal. The tools had moved through a retired workshop and a dealer and into Devers's hands without the full history following them, but the end point of the chain was a craftsman who used the tools well, who maintained them with the care they deserved, and who would, Watson was certain from the quality of the afternoon visit, receive the full account of what he was holding with the honesty and the gratitude that the account deserved. Edith said nothing for a long moment after Holmes completed the account. Then she said that her father had been right, had done what was right in the specific form that the situation had required of him, and that the understanding of this was what she had needed and what she now had. Watson attended to this with the full quality of the attention it deserved and found in it the specific form of the resolution that the 10 investigations had consistently produced when the investigation was most fully itself, not the dramatic resolution, not the formal conclusion, but the specific human settling of a question that had needed the settling and that had finally received it. The conversation with Devers occurred on the 4th morning, and Watson was present for it in the specific role that he had occupied for most of the Clerkenwell dimension of the investigation, not as the analyst, not as the recorder, but as the human witness, the person whose presence communicated to the other people in the conversation that what was occurring was significant and that the significance deserved to be received with the full quality of the attention it required. Edith had asked to tell it herself. This had been her request at the end of the Baker Street 3rd evening, and it was the right request. It was her father's story and the story of the finest thing her father had made, and she was the person who understood it most completely and who consequently was the person who could communicate it most fully. Holmes had agreed immediately, which Watson noted as the specific form of Holmes's agreement that communicated not merely consent but genuine recognition that the agreement was the right response. They had sent a note to Devers the previous evening, requesting the meeting at his workshop at 9 in the morning on the 4th day. Devers had responded promptly, and the response had the quality of someone who had found the request slightly surprising but who had no reason to be unwilling. He received them with the same quality of mild surprise and genuine politeness that he had received Watson and Edith 2 days before, and the three of them sat in the specific space of the workshop's small front room, where Devers received clients and conducted the business of the work, with the tools visible through the open door to the working space beyond. Edith told it. She told it in the specific form that Watson had observed her moving toward across the 4 days of the investigation. The form not of the grievance or the demand, but the form of the full account communicated with the honesty and the care that the account deserved. She told who Felix Vane was and what he had made and what the commission had been and what the commission had meant to him. She told who Carrere was and what his work was and why Felix had valued the commission as the one most worthy of the finest work he was capable of. She told the death of Carrere and the completion of the commission after it and the specific deliberateness of Felix's decision about where the tools should go and why. She told the chain of possession that had moved the tools from their intended recipient through the retirement and the sale and the dealer to the workshop in which they were now sitting. Devers listened with the quality of someone receiving something that was both entirely unexpected and entirely legible once received. Watson attended to the listening with the quality of attention he brought to all the significant moments of the investigation's human conclusions, the attention not of someone who was watching the moment from the outside but of someone who was present with it in the fullest available form, who was receiving what the moment contained alongside the people in it. The specific quality of Devers's listening was the quality of a craftsman receiving an account about the tools of his trade, an account that was also, and inseparably, an account about the person who had made those tools and about what the making had meant. He was not listening with the detachment of someone processing information about something peripheral to his daily life and work. He was listening with the full, specific engagement of someone who was receiving information about the most central thing, about the tools he had been working with for 9 years, whose quality he had been aware of throughout the 9 years in the form that a craftsman's hands and eyes were aware of the quality of the tools they worked with, whose specific character he had maintained and protected with the care that the quality had deserved. The account placed the tools he knew, the tools whose weight and balance and specific character of the edge he knew as well as he knew anything, in a history he had not known. And the placing was not the placing of something alien or external into contact with something familiar. It was the completing of the familiar, the revelation of the history that the familiar thing had always had and that the familiar thing had consequently always been, even in the years when the history had not been known to the person who held the thing. Devers listened with the quality of someone receiving something that was both entirely unexpected and entirely legible once received, the quality of someone who had not known the story and who was, in the receiving of it, finding that the story made complete sense of something he had always known partially and instinctively. He had known, from the quality of the tools, that they were exceptional. He had not known what the exceptionality meant in the specific form of its history and its meaning. Now he knew. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had worked with these tools for 9 years and had understood, throughout the 9 years, that they were unlike anything else he had used, and that the understanding of why they were unlike anything else was something he had not expected to receive and was grateful for. Edith said that her father had wanted the tools to be used by the best available person. She said this directly and without sentimentality, in the specific form of someone who was communicating a fact and who trusted the person receiving the fact to understand what the fact required of them. She said that the use of them well was all that the history of them required. Watson attended to this exchange with the full quality of the attention that the investigations had developed in him as the most important of all the capabilities they required. He was attending to both people simultaneously, to Edith and to Devers, and to the specific quality of what was passing between them, and he found in the attending the specific thing he had found at the conclusions of the best of the 10 investigations, the quality of something settling into its right form. Not perfectly, there was no perfect form available for a situation whose history had been as complicated as this one. But rightly, in the specific sense of the thing most fully itself that the history allowed. Watson walked back to Baker Street from Saffron Hill through the October morning with the quality of the walk that the concluded investigation always produced, the settling walk, the walk of someone carrying the completed thing and allowing it to find its level in the specific form that the completing had produced. The October streets had the quality that the October streets had always had and always would have, the amber of the plane trees, the specific light, the cold that was genuinely cold rather than the preliminary cold of September, the quality of a city that had fully committed to its indoor season and that was conducting its daily life in that commitment without apology or regret. He had been thinking, on the walk, about Felix Vane. About the specific act of deliberateness that the investigation had recovered from the 11 years of the carrying, the act of a man who had completed the finest work of his professional life in the knowledge that the intended recipient was dead, and who had done the most considered thing available with what he had completed. Watson had found, across the 10 investigations, that the walk of the concluded investigation was the walk in which the most important thinking occurred, not the thinking about what had happened or why, which was done, but the thinking about what the investigation had meant and what it contributed to the accumulated understanding that the series of investigations was building. Not every investigation contributed to this accumulated understanding in the same form. Some investigations contributed something that was primarily the analytical, the specific form of the analytical intelligence applied to a situation of specific complexity, demonstrating once more the capability that the demonstration was always demonstrating. Some contributed something that was primarily the human, the specific quality of the human intelligence applied to a situation that the analytical intelligence alone could not address. The instrument maker of Saffron Hill was the humankind. It had been, from the beginning, an investigation that Watson's specific capabilities were most necessary for, the visit to the workshop, the conversations through the neighborhood, the quality of the attention that had recognized in Devers the honest possessor rather than the wrongful one, the presence at the conversation with Edith that the investigation's resolution had required. Holmes had provided the analytical architecture. Watson had provided the human structure on which the analytical architecture was built and in which it was made useful. Watson had been thinking, in the course of the walk, about what this pattern meant in the context of the 10 investigations as a series. The series had a shape, an accumulated shape, visible only in retrospect and only from the position of someone who had been present for each of the 10 investigations and who consequently had the full picture of what the 10 together constituted. The shape was not the shape of Holmes's development, which was the shape that a different account might have emphasized. The shape was the shape of Watson's development. End. the development of the specific quality of the human intelligence and the human attention that the investigations had required from the beginning, and that Watson had, across the 10 investigations, developed to a level that he recognized, in the honesty of the settling walk, as genuinely different from what he had brought to the first investigation. He had been thinking, on the walk, about Felix Vane. About the specific act of deliberateness that the investigation had recovered from the 11 years of the carrying, the act of a man who had completed the finest work of his professional life in the knowledge that the intended recipient was dead, and who had done the most considered thing available with what he had completed. The act communicated something that Watson found, in the thinking about it, both entirely legible and genuinely moving. The commitment to the right disposition of the work as something that the making required, regardless of the circumstances that had made the right disposition complicated. This commitment was, Watson had come to understand across the 10 investigations, the quality that the series had been most consistently about, the quality beneath the various specific qualities of the various specific situations, the quality that the watchmaker and the glassmaker and the solicitor and the archivist and now the instrument maker had all expressed in their specific and various forms. The commitment that the finest made thing deserved the finest disposition. The commitment that the person who had made the finest thing owed to it, beyond the making itself, the specific attention to what happened to the thing after the making, the attention that said the thing was not merely a product whose disposal was a practical question but an expression of the maker's most essential capability, whose continuing existence in the world deserved to be in the form that expression deserved. Felix Vane had understood this. He had understood it in the specific form of the instrument maker whose tools were the finest expression of what the instrument maker could do, and he had acted on the understanding in the most deliberate and the most considered way available to him in the specific circumstances in which the understanding had presented itself. The acting had been imperfect, because the world was imperfect, and the chain of possession that followed the deliberate giving was the world rather than the intention. But the acting had been right, in the specific sense of the thing most fully itself that the circumstances allowed. Watson wrote this in the journal that evening, when he returned to his own lodgings and sat down with the journal and the October evening and the specific quality of the settled investigation. He wrote it in the form that the best of the journal entries had, the form of the understanding rather than merely the facts, the form that communicated what the investigation had been about rather than merely what it had done. He wrote about Felix Vane carrying the tools through the October evening of Saffron Hill. He wrote about Marchetti's memory and what the memory communicated about Felix's understanding of what he owed to the finest thing he had made. He wrote about Devers's listening and what the listening had communicated about the quality of the possession that Felix's deliberateness had eventually produced. And he wrote, at the end, the thing that each of the 10 investigations had produced in its own specific form and that the 10 together had been building toward in the accumulated way of the series. The understanding that the finest made things were the person in the most fully expressed form available, and that what happened to the finest made things after the making was consequently not a practical question but a human one, the question of whether the expression of the person's most essential capability would continue in the world in the form it deserved, in the possession of the hands and the eyes and the attention that could receive it honestly. Felix Vane's tools were in those hands now. The question was answered. The act communicated something that Watson found, in the thinking about it, both entirely legible and genuinely moving, the commitment to the right disposition of the work as something that the making required, regardless of the circumstances that had made the right disposition complicated. The work deserved to go to the person who would use it as the work deserved. That was what the making meant. That was what the finest making always meant. Holmes was in the sitting room when Watson arrived, in the specific between investigations quality that Baker Street had when an investigation had been completed and the next had not yet arrived. He asked whether the morning had produced the conclusion that the investigation required, and Watson said that it had, in the specific form that the conclusion was most genuinely a conclusion. Not the formal, the legal, the institutionally determined, but the human one, the one that the people whose situation it was had been able to arrive at in the presence of the full account of what the situation actually was. Holmes said that was the best kind. His tone was the tone he used when he meant what he said without particular elaboration, the tone Watson had come to associate with Holmes's most direct engagements with the human dimension of the investigations, the dimension that Holmes acknowledged and respected without having the specific capability for it that Watson had developed across the decade of the work together. There was a moment of quiet in the sitting room after this exchange. Not the uncomfortable quiet of people who had nothing to say to each other or who were avoiding what needed to be said, but the quiet of people who were simply present with what had been done and who were allowing themselves to be present with it in the specific form that the doing deserved. The fire was at its October level. The gas lamps provided the specific quality of the lit Baker Street evening. The investigation was complete in the form it needed to be complete. Watson found himself thinking, in the quiet, about the series, about what the 10 investigations together constituted and what the instrument maker of Saffron Hill had added to what the 10 together were. The widow of Penrose Street had given them a watchmaker's technique reclaimed from a 15-year theft. The glass correspondent had given them a formula restored to the public knowledge of a field. The debt of the Cartwright rooms had given them a founding collection made complete. The patience of Mr. Dove had given them a manuscript returned to the archive where it belonged. The instrument maker of Saffron Hill had given them something different in form from all of these, though the same in its essential character. Not the restoration of the thing to an institution or a public, not the correction of a specific wrong committed by a specific person, but the completion of the historical record, the account of what had happened to the finest thing, communicated in the honest form to the person who most needed the honest form. In a situation where the thing had not been stolen and there was no formal wrong to correct and the only mechanism available for the addressing of the situation was the specific. Patient, human intelligence applied to the evidence in the form that the evidence deserved. Holmes said that was the best kind. His tone was the tone he used when he meant what he said without particular elaboration, the tone Watson had come to associate with Holmes's most direct engagements with the human dimension of the investigations, the dimension that Holmes acknowledged and respected without having the specific capability for it that Watson had developed across the decade of the work together. Watson sat in his armchair. The fire was at its October level. The October London was the October London outside the slightly open window, the plane trees and the amber and the cold and the specific quality of the season fully itself. The tools were in Devers's workshop on the street off Saffron Hill, in the hands that Felix Vane's deliberateness had eventually placed them in, with the full history of the making and the giving now present alongside the tools in the form of the knowledge of the person who used them. The finest work of Felix Vane's professional life was where it needed to be, being used in the form it deserved, maintained with the care it required. Edith Vane was returning to her workshop through the October morning, carrying something different from what she had been carrying when she had arrived at Baker Street 4 days before. Watson had not followed her progress from the Devers workshop back to her own, had not been present for whatever the remainder of the morning in Saffron Hill had produced, for what the walk back through the 2 streets had given her and what the returning to the bench and the light and the specific environment of the long professional life had communicated on the first day of the changed understanding. But he could attend to what the 4 days had been, and what the 4th morning's conclusion had provided, and what the providing had given her from the position of someone who had attended to Edith Vane throughout the investigation with the quality of attention he had developed across the 10 investigations as the most specific and most consistently valuable of all the capabilities the investigations had required. She had been carrying, for 11 years, the specific form of the absence not of the tools themselves, which she had assumed had been collected by the estate and had not grieved in any formal sense, but of the knowledge of what had happened to them and what their being wherever they were communicated about her father and about the finest work of her father's professional life. The absence of the knowledge was the absence of the final account, the account that would have allowed her to be in relationship with her father's professional legacy in the complete form, in the form that included the finest thing rather than leaving it in the gap of the not knowing. She was returning to her workshop carrying the full account. The full account was not a comfortable thing in all its dimensions, the specific difficulty of the 11 years' absence, the chain of possession that had moved the tools through hands that had not known their history, the specific imperfection of the disposition compared with the disposition Felix had intended, was part of the account and remained part of the account even in the resolution. But the discomfort of the full account was a different thing from the discomfort of the absence. The full account could be in relationship with. The absence could only be carried. Edith Vane was returning to her workshop through the October morning, carrying something different from what she had been carrying when she had arrived at Baker Street 4 days before. Not lighter, exactly. More complete. The weight that remained was the weight of the full account rather than the weight of the absence, the weight of the understanding that her father had been right, had done what was right, had found the form of the disposition that the finest thing he had ever made deserved. This was a different thing from the 11 years of the gap. Watson attended to the sitting room and the fire and the October morning and was simply there, in the way that the 10 investigations had taught him to be simply there, fully present in the specific form that the specific moment required, without any requirement on the moment beyond the moment's actual character. The investigation was complete. The season was October. The maker's finest work was in the right hands. Watson remained in the armchair for some time after Holmes had returned to the index. The October afternoon had the quality of the October afternoon in Baker Street when the investigation was done and the next had not yet arrived, and the specific, settled, genuinely restful quality of the between investigations Baker Street was most fully present. The light through the window came in at the October angle that communicated both the season's specific quality and the specific time of the afternoon, the light that was present but declining, that communicated the approach of the early dark that October produced without communicating the dark itself, the light that was itself a form of the between the full afternoon and the coming evening, between the investigation just concluded and the next one not yet begun. The 10 investigations had been conducted across 2.5 years of the autumn and the spring and the winter and the summer and all the various seasonal qualities of Baker Street and the London that Baker Street was embedded in. They had moved through the October streets and the January fogs and the April parks and the late September mornings with the plane trees in their early colour. They had moved through Islington and Marylebone and Bloomsbury and Saffron Hill and the various other parts of the city that the investigations had required, each neighbourhood adding its specific quality to the accumulated picture of London that the series had been building alongside the accumulated understanding of the specific human situations the investigations had addressed. The accumulated picture was, Watson found, both the picture of London and the picture of what people were in London, what people were in the specific and particular form that the finest made things and the finest professional lives and the finest human relationships expressed them. The series had been consistently about this, the finest expression of the person, and what happened to the finest expression when the world intervened between the expression and the form it deserved. The answer, across the 10 investigations, had been consistent: the world intervened, always, in the specific and imperfect way of the world, and the finest expression found its form, always, through the specific and patient and honest work of the people who attended to it with the full quality of the attention it required. Watson was one of those people. This was what the 10 investigations had made him, and he was grateful for the making. And Baker Street, in the October afternoon, was entirely and specifically itself. Thanks for being here tonight. The tool bench, the old man who remembered the conversation, the 11 years of carrying and the resolution that found them, all of it is in the feed. Drop a comment and tell me where you are. Come and find the rest of the series whenever you're ready. Sleep well. The Instrument Maker of Saffron Hill. 10 investigations. The October that brought the question and the October that answered it. Felix Vane, who carried the finest tools he ever made through the lamplit evening of the Italian quarter of Clerkenwell to the only person who could tell him what to do next, and who was right to carry them and right to give them and right about who deserved to have them, in the imperfect and entirely human form of all the rightness that the 10 investigations had recovered and recorded and given back. Baker Street was where it had always been. Watson was who the investigations had made him. The next case, whenever it arrived, would find him ready.